Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, February 11th, 1954, it actually happened on February 10th, 1954, President Eisenhower was asked about escalating tensions in Vietnam, where for several years, Vietnamese forces were fighting French colonial forces. And on this day, at least, President Eisenhower indicated that he did not want the United States to get involved. At this press conference on February 10th, he said, quote, "I cannot conceive of a greater tragedy for America than to get heavily involved in an all-out war in any of those regions." Around the same time, reports are that he told his advisors that, quote, he simply could not imagine the United States putting ground forces anywhere in Southeast Asia. That, of course, as you know, would change into the late 50s and into the 60s and 70s. The war in Vietnam would escalate and involve more and more U.S. troops. So the question for us in this moment and on this episode is, what do we make of Eisenhower's declaration that the U.S. would not get involved way back in 1954, and why that actually started to change pretty quickly? So here to discuss, as always, is Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Nikki.
Hello, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello, Kellie.
Hey.
Nikki, a couple shows ago, I don't remember when it was, but, I sort of had this little riff where I said that I've come to understand that the story of Vietnam, we should expand it a little earlier and include JFK. And now I'm realizing that, that's even more complicated because maybe we have to ultimately ask how much Eisenhower set the stage for this war. And I think that's the big question we'll kind of get to. But in this moment, early 1954, why is Eisenhower expressing such reluctance to get involved? And how genuine is that reluctance?
Well, first, I need to welcome you to the world of historians where we're always pushing things back further and further.
So true. So true.
This is why George Washington is responsible for U.S. involvement in Vietnam. In this case, I think to get into Eisenhower's mind, he comes into the presidency in the middle of another war. The Korean War, which had started in 1950 under President Truman, had at first seemed like a pretty straightforward war. The U.S. troops very quickly advanced toward their goal, but then they're pushed back into a stalemate that lasts for years. And Eisenhower sees this kind of stuckness of this fight, and it colors how he proceeds in Vietnam. So he wraps up the war in Korea in 1953, and his mantra going forward is no more Koreas. And when he looked at Vietnam, he saw Korea and did not want to see the U.S. get involved in another 3-year war. 3 years is so long.
Yeah. And so, is it our sense that he is genuinely saying, the U.S. is not going to stick its nose into this region anymore?
Stick their nose in is very different from an all-out ground war.
Okay.
So Eisenhower believes that the U.S. needs to continue to engage communists and communist regimes around the world, and that it cannot just abandon, in this case, its French allies who are fighting this war in Vietnam. And so he doesn't want the U.S. to get involved in the kind of war that the French have been fighting for something like 8 years at that point, but he also doesn't think that the U.S. can ignore this region, because if Vietnam becomes communist, then Cambodia will become communist, and Laos, and pretty soon the whole world is communist because you didn't fight for Vietnam.
Yeah, and I think that's where the whole domino theory comes in. So at first, I think his reasons for not wanting to get involved may seem legitimate. So he makes claims about the economic importance and the, specific value of the productions that are produced by Vietnam. So the rubber, the jute, the sulfur. And he talks about, the possibility of dictatorships and how that becomes a problem in a free world. But it's really this domino theory, this idea that if Vietnam falls, or if Vietnam is sort of the Simon Says that allows other regions to take on these communistic ideas, then the U.S. will no longer be able to have, a grip or a stronghold in terms of how we think of democracy and freedom and so forth, and really can't control the outcome of elections as well.
One interesting thing is, we're talking about remarks he makes in February. As Kellie alluded, by April, he's kind of giving a speech about the domino theory, and he's fully embraced this idea and this fear that Kellie laid out. So what is it that changed in those few months that made him realize, the first domino might be about to fall?
One of the big things, and Kellie's talking about trying to defend democracy in the face of communism, is that the U.S. enters into the Geneva Accords. And what that says is that in a few years, in 1956, Vietnam is going to be able to have free and fair elections. They can pick their leader. This will be great. There'll be a new democracy in Southeast Asia. And it pretty quickly becomes clear that if that election happens, Ho Chi Minh, who is the leader of the nationalist communist movement in Vietnam, is easily going to win that election. And so now the U.S. is in the position, and Eisenhower is in the position where he has convinced himself that in order to make the world safe for democracy, he has to deprive the Vietnamese people of their democratic right to this election. So even though the U.S. had signed the Geneva Accords and said, absolutely, we back these elections, the U.S. is going to help cancel those elections in 56.
And those accords were signed, again, the same time, early 54, and reporting after the fact has revealed that it's pretty immediate, as you're saying, that the U.S. sees how this is going to play out and sees that the first domino is going to fall. And so, Kellie, I'm curious, how much should we think of the story of Vietnam as in the first half of 1954, an inevitable die was cast as Eisenhower shifted in the way that we've just been describing from February to April and embracing this domino theory? I mean, does that basically say from then on out, we're going to have 25 years of involvement and forever war?
Well, it's funny. I'm always telling my students, historians never say anything is inevitable. Nothing is inevitable. But on the other hand, I do think that we make a series of choices that can lead us on a path that's very difficult to jump off of. And I think that, in some ways, Eisenhower is really opening Pandora's box. And he's, once he gets certain ideas in his head about what could happen, what might happen, he's unable to politically backtrack from that. And then I think each successor after him has to ask these same questions and make these same sort of difficult decisions. And it does sort of seem like we've set a track that's very difficult to stop and even more difficult to get off of.
Yeah, and he does lay a trap of logic and language that doesn't make this inevitable, but makes policymakers in the U.S. feel trapped by events that are happening in Vietnam. I mean, that's the idea behind the domino theory, right? The thing that happens, you get that one little push and then gravity takes over. And that was meant to describe the spread of communism, but it also could describe the U.S.'s approach to Vietnam, that there was kind of the domino theory pushed down those dominoes and led them into greater and greater and greater involvement. And Eisenhower deserves some credit for not escalating quite so rapidly during the 1950s. He was somebody who was very good at seeing problems, but not necessarily stopping them, right? This is the same guy who warns against the military-industrial complex after 8 years of just hyperactively building it up. So he was better at talking about the dangers than stopping them.
Yeah. But I love that notion of the kind of different games of dominoes being played. And there's some because we think of the domino theory as this large, you look at a huge world map. But there is actually, as you were saying, this domino theory of internal politics in Vietnam. And I will say, watching the Ken Burns documentary about Vietnam, I think that's one of the things that I really learned. I think was really well highlighted there was that how much internal politics in Vietnam and often very small choices and twists and turns, those were the dominoes. That was the thing that was providing the logic of the U.S.'s decision making. And I think that the tragedy of it all was 20 years of no one taking that step back and saying, what are we doing here? It was always just reacting. Kellie, I think you were saying this as to that sort of next little choice, and it was adding up to this larger thing.
And I think part of it is the U.S. leaders' inability to understand that they could be the pawn in someone else's game.
Yeah, right.
Right. Vietnam wasn't just the piece they were moving around on the chessboard, but U.S. intervention was something that various factions within Vietnam were using to gain power or to promote their cause.
And that's kind of America's Achilles heel, is that they never see themselves as being the pawn. They never see themselves as being moved around in someone else's game. It's, they are the movers. And so I think that plays into a lot of the unending or unfinished, if you will, conflict.
Yeah. All right, so we've done a dominoes metaphor and a chess metaphor. I'm trying to think of a checkers or a Monopoly metaphor to wrap this show up with. I can't get there.
It's always Monopoly.
Yes,
Tones of Dunshire, I think, is.
Yeah. Right. Exactly.
Well, although Monopoly is the endless game that everyone kind of hates 15 minutes in is probably the right one.
There's your next book. Everyone thinks that they're playing dominoes or chess, but actually at the end of the day, we're playing Monopoly. Yes.
Monopoly. Or Settlers of Catan. I love Settlers of Catan.
Okay. All right.
This is now Board Games.
Yes. Our spin-off podcast on board game metaphors. Okay. We're going to leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Follow us on social media at This Day Pod. We're posting all sorts of things on Twitter and Instagram each day, reacting to your questions and comments as we go. You can also find more information about the show at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
The United States cannot station its troops all over the world to protect every area in which we have a vital interest. The essence of collective security is, as rapidly as possible, to lodge the responsibility for the defense of those areas upon their own population.
Radiotopia from